Coming to you from beautiful British Columbia, it's Earth, We Can Do This with host Paul W. Slusher.
Did you know that a rapist, a murderer, a person with an incredibly violent history can buy a gun legally in the United States? That's right. A person with a horrible criminal background, a mentally deranged individual, somebody with a history of abusing people or animals or whatever, can buy a gun legally in the United States. And why is that? Well, I'm going to get into all of that in a minute. This is Guns Part 2 podcast. This is the second part of the first part series, Part 1. I talked at length about the United States versus all the various major Western nations, France, Germany, UK, Australia, Canada, compared the statistics, compared the data, and looked at the information. And there's some seriously damning information there that you should go back. If you haven't listened to Guns number 1, listen to that one first before you listen to this one. So pause this one, go back, listen to the first one, and then come back to this one. The reason why is because that one lays all the groundwork for the incredibly, shocking, and I'm not kidding, shocking information I'm about to lay out on you. We've got some quotes and advertisements from the N.R.A. We've got a soundbite from Ted Nugent, if you know who that guy is, and even good old President Trump. I don't know how long he's going to be president for, but either way, this guy and what he says also is just repugnant. Now, I want to start by, before I get into the topic, first I need to mention our sponsor. My name is Paul W. Slusher. I am the owner, founder, and CEO of a company called contactsforless.ca. If you're in Canada, you should be buying your contact lenses at contactsforless.ca and nowhere else. And the reason why? Because we save you a ton of money on contact lenses online, and you get to help save the planet. Over half of our net profits go to the nonprofit that you choose. You choose. It's not like the grocery store when they take a buck and they give it to whoever, and you don't know who they're giving it to. No, you get to choose where that money goes. And so we are the very first company of any type in the world to do this with eyewear. And we are by far the most progressive online seller in Canada that we know of. So if you're in Canada, go to contactsforless.ca, buy your contact lenses, help save the planet, do a good thing. And now, so you may be asking, so why are we doing this podcast? I say this in every podcast. I will until we get through our first year probably. I want to remind you, the reason why I do this podcast is because we're not trying to promote the brand. Honestly, we're not going to be able to do it. This isn't doing any advertising for contactsforless.ca really. A ton of people are listening to the podcast, but most of the people are from other parts of the world, honestly. So far, we've had people from Ireland and Malaysia. You name it. People from all over the world have heard our podcast. So it's not about that. It's about representing an idea that we can save this planet, that we can work together and save this crazy planet that we are literally destroying from so many different angles. It's almost innumerable. Okay. So let me get into the topic here. I don't want to waste any more time. We're 3 minutes in already. I want to get directly into the topic because there's a lot to cover. And this is a shorter podcast than we've been doing. We're moving to a 45 minute, length on our podcast. So I don't want to get caught up in spending too much time on any other topics. So let's get right down to it. So before I get into the Second Amendment and Ted Nugent and a bunch of other craziness, I want to talk about this Texas gunman, some guy named Devin Kelly, I think his name is. And it was on November 5th, I believe. He shot and killed, and the number on my piece of paper in front of me says 26. I think actually more people died later. He shot babies. He shot a woman who was pregnant. This piece of garbage. Oh, I just have to say, I'm not really into revenge at all. That's not my thing. But I hope they throw him into a pen with a whole bunch of other people and they let him. Oh, I just hope in prison I won't even say it. I just think this guy, horrible human being. In any case, I want to read to you a little bit from the CNN article that came out the very next day after this slaughter. Kelly was a member of the U.S. Air Force and served at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico from 2010 until his discharge which was, I think, around 2012. Yes, he was court-martialed in 2012 for assault on his spouse and assault on their child. He served a year in confinement, received a bad contact discharge, and had his rank reduced. In April 2016, Kelly purchased a Ruger AR-556 rifle he allegedly used in the shooting from a store in San Antonio, Texas. There was no disqualifying information in the background check as required for the purchase, so he ended up being able to buy this weapon. He tried to buy a weapon in Texas and was denied. Okay. Now, we found out subsequently that that the military screwed up and didn't put the information on the registrar, the system that registers violent offenders, etc., for the national registration, whatever it's called. Now, the reality of that is that little mistake is bad enough. But here's the truth. He could have gone to a gun show and bought a gun. He could have gone and privately bought a gun. He could have bought almost anything, and nobody would be able to stop him. So this whole talk about the military screwing up there and all this, it's irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant. And why people are falling for this dialogue is because the N.R.A. is running the dialogue. They're the ones running the dialogue. So we're going to get into this, boy. We are going to get into this. If you feel strongly about guns, either way, on either side of this topic, you need to hear what we're talking about today, because this is just outrageous what we're going to talk about today. And I think you're going to be shocked, even if you're a gun supporter and you support the Second Amendment and you believe in the right to bear arms and whatever that means for you. We're going to get into that. You still need to remember that children are being killed. Babies are being killed. This guy shot, I think it was a 3-year-old. He shot her on the ground. When she was on the ground, he shot her, according to witnesses. Killed her. That's insane. So before we get into any more of this, I'm going to jump right into Ted Nugent. Ted Nugent's a rocker, Ted Nugent, Cat Scratch Fever and all that. Well, he's a horrible musician to start with. I mean, he's just, honestly, I can't stand the guy from a musical viewpoint. He's just, butt rock in my mind. But let's put that aside. I'm going to take my biases about his music aside. Let's just hear from him first, okay? Because he was on back in the day when Piers Morgan was on CNN. He was on there. And here's a little quote from him. So I'm just going to step aside and let him speak, and I'll catch you on the backside.
Kiss my ass. Yes. Where you have the most armed citizens in America, yes. You have the lowest violent crime rate. Where you have the worst gun control, you have the highest crime rate. Piers, choose one. Do you want a lot of crime? We have it. Gun-free zones. Do you want less crime? We have that. More people with concealed weapons permit. Why do you guys resist that statistic?
Okay, thank you, Ted. So he doesn't beat around the bush, does he? So he says most armed citizens, lowest crime rate. Strongest gun control, highest crime rate. All right, let's just start with the fact that is absolute BS, okay? BS. It's not even close to true. And let me tell you a little bit about that. Now, if you listen to podcast number 1 on guns, part 1, you will have heard a lot of information on this, but I'm going to touch on it one more time, okay? There's been a series of reports on this, and there is absolutely no evidence that higher levels of gun ownership lower crime. In fact, the conclusion of one report that came out of Boston University, School of Public Health, and here's a quote from their report. We observed a robust correlation between higher levels of gun ownership and higher firearm homicide rates. Okay? That's it. So they're actually saying the opposite of what Ted is saying. But let's get into a little bit more of this. Let me get to my other bit of report here. It's right in front of me. I've got a bunch of paperwork in front of me. You have to excuse me. Okay, this is another report, okay? This was a report they did they did a study in Memphis, Tennessee, New York, or Portland, Oregon, New Orleans, and they combined a bunch of information. This was based on FBI statistics. The overall homicide rate among the metro areas whose principal city is in a state that requires some form of permit to purchase a gun is 4.32 per 100,000 residents, compared with 5.74, which is higher, among cities in no permit states. Okay? So the overall homicide rate is higher. People are killing each other more with guns. Okay? Where there are no permits required. Okay. And then, now let's talk about crime. Ted's just lying. Ted Nugent is just lying to you, and so is the N.R.A. Similarly, the overall burglary rate among the metro areas whose principal city is in a state that requires some form of permit to purchase a gun is 442 per 100,000 residents. Okay, so the burglary rate in a state that has a permit to purchase a gun is 442 per 100,000 residents. In states that do not have a permit requirement to carry a weapon, the burglary rate is 690 per 100,000. Okay, that's what, 17, 20% higher? Okay, that's FBI stats. So Ted Nugent's just lying to you. Okay, so let's just get the lies out of the way. Now, what does the public think? What do Americans actually think about gun control? Well, here's the thing. In June, from June 22nd to June 27th, 2017, this year, the Quinnipiac University poll, they did a survey of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And here's what they came up with. The question was, do you support or oppose stricter gun laws in the United States? Now, not surprising, only 27% of Republicans think there should be stricter laws. Well, that's not surprising. Republicans seem to not care that much about people dying and care more about some nebulous, theoretical freedom that they think they have. And we're going to get into, by the way, this freedom that they think they have, because that's also BS. And we're going to get into that. 68% said yes, 27% said yes, 68% said no. That's Republicans. Among Democrats, 80% said yes, 18% said no, and among independents, 54% said yes, 42% said no. Now, before we get into the next set of stats, let me just point something out. Mathematically, there are far more Democrats and independents. Well, first of all, there are more Democrats than Republicans in the United States, period. Okay? Democrats don't vote often, and that's one of the reasons why they don't win every single election. If they did, they'd win literally almost every single national election and many states. There'd be far less red states, let's just put it that way. But the media does a really good job, and the N.R.A. does a really good job of convincing certain people to act scared and vote scared. But there are clearly more Democrats than Republicans. But when you throw in the independents, there's 54% of independents are in favor of stricter gun control, and 80% of Democrats, right there, mathematically, it's not even close. A majority of Americans, by far, support gun control, stricter gun laws. Another question that they asked was, do you support or oppose requiring background checks for all gun buyers? Now listen to this. All gun buyers. That means no gun show loophole, no private sale loophole, none of that. Okay? That was what the question's based on. Republicans, listen to this. This is shocking. 93% of Republicans said that they support background checks. 98% of Democrats and 95% of independents. 93%, 98%, 95%. And these horrible politicians are being bought and sold by the N.R.A. and completely going against every single thing that the United States American citizens actually believe. Now, I live in Canada, thank God, where we don't have this kind of ridiculousness. The N.R.A. doesn't have any power in Canada, and Canadian gun owners aren't nearly as nuts or lying as much as the hardcore right wing that you see in the United States. And I'm sorry to be bashing the U.S. because I love the U.S. I'm a dual citizen. I'm a U.S. and Canadian citizen, born and raised in Seattle. Now I live in British Columbia. And I'll tell you, I'm still very much a patriot. I'm a big Bernie Sanders supporter. I think he's a great guy. I'm not a huge fan of Hillary, but I think she was okay. She was certainly better than Trump. And so I'm a liberal, yes. But I'm an intelligent, educated liberal who wants to see all sides of the topic. That's my thing. I'm really focused on making sure that I have the stats, the proper stats, to back up what I'm saying. Okay, that's very important to me. And so what I'm doing here today is, yes, I'm giving you a strong amount of opinion, but it's because I've already looked at the data, I've already looked at the statistics, and I've studied the history of the Second Amendment. And I'm here to tell you that this whole story about the Second Amendment being a right to bear arms is bull bleep. Sorry, I try not to swear on my podcast. But, I mean it. It's just outrageous that they're making this claim, and I'm going to get into that at the back end. But there is no question about it that Americans are in favor of stricter gun laws, and they're in favor of background checks, and yet the laws stay exactly the way they do. And okay, so I'm going to get into my conclusions at the end. I could preach all day about how disgusting this is. But let's get into a little bit about what Donald Trump, I'm not even going to call him president. I'm sorry, I'm not, because I just have no respect for this man, for his lies, for his countless lies. An upcoming podcast, by the way, is coming up on all the lies of Trump. I'm going to do one whole show, just one whole amazing show with tons of quotes and tons of sound bites of just him lying, just lying and lying and lying. All right, here's a short quote. I'm going to step out of the way and I'll catch it on the back end, where he talks a little bit about how Obama went too far and what he's going to do with executive orders. This is really something else. Take a listen to this.
Hillary wants to go into the opposite direction. She said that President Obama didn't go far enough when he executed this order, when he signed this order, and he's not going far enough. He's gone so far, he's gone too far, we're going to stop it. And we will unsign lots of different things, including some of those terrible executive orders. Believe me, they're going to be unsigned so fast. They'll be unsigned the first hour that I'm in office, in the first hour that I'm in office.
Yep, he's going to unsign those executive orders in his first hour, is he? Yeah, well, he did a bunch of that. But let's get into then what he said just a little bit after that. This, by the way, I didn't tell you that when I first gave you that first quote, that first soundbite. This is a speech he gave to the N.R.A. when he was running for office. Okay, I should have given you that at the beginning. Sorry. Now, here's what's interesting about this is that he then goes on just literally 12 seconds later to say the following.
Hillary's pledged to issue new anti-gun executive orders. You know that. This is the behavior, you could say, of a dictator. This is the behavior of somebody, frankly, I think, that doesn't know what she's doing. She's not equipped to be president in so many different ways. But this is the thinking of a person that is not equipped to be the president of the United States. Believe me, she doesn't understand it. Bad judgment. We talk about it. She's got bad judgment.
Okay. All right there, Donald. Let me tell you a little bit about how ridiculous that BS he just fed the N.R.A. is. He talks about how executive orders are a sign of a dictatorship. Well, Donald, you signed 54 executive orders in your first year in office. 54, okay? None of the past 4 presidents have even signed 54 executive orders in their entire presidency. Obama signed 44 in 8 years. Okay? 8 years. Trump has signed 54 in 1 year. So Trump, you're a liar. We all knew that though. Is anybody surprised that Trump is a bull-faced liar? Nope, not me. I'm not surprised one bit. And you know what's funny is when he was running for office, you could tell he was a liar. You could just tell the guy was a scumbag. And he's bought and paid for by the hardcore right. Whether he's truly a right-winger, it's really anybody's guess. Because I really think his whole strategy is to just be in power because he's a megalomaniac. He's an egocentric idiot. And he really is. He's maybe one of the least intelligent presidents since Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan wasn't too sharp either. Sorry for those people who worship Reagan. But he was, not a bright man. In fact, on a side note, just briefly, I did some research on Reagan many years ago. And it was very interesting. When he was trying to run for governor, a group of Stanford's behavioral scientists and political scientists met with him to try to prep him for his governorship race. And they found that he was incapable of comprehending the issues. So they had to make a flip book so that he could know what his policies should be because they were written by somebody else. Reagan was like that. Trump is worse. Trump doesn't read anything. He just reacts. He watches TV. He tweets like a complete idiot. And he lies more than he tells the truth. Literally, I can't wait to do the podcast on Trump lying. I think you're going to love it. It's going to be funny. We're going to make it fun. It's not going to be so dark. We're just going to make fun of Trump for a whole 45 minutes. Okay, but let's get to this whole right to bear arms thing. Okay, let's get down to it. Let's get into the topic that really matters. The whole principle as to why Americans can worship guns the way they do without any restriction is because the Second Amendment supposedly protects the right to bear arms. What does the Second Amendment read? For those of you who don't know, it reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, that's what it says. That's the Second Amendment. Okay, now let's get into, briefly if we can here, a little bit about this. Okay, now I'm going to be reading some excerpts and taking some comments from this article I came across by a gentleman named Alan Uhas. Okay, it was did this year. It was actually written in October. All right, so some of which is I'm going to be reading, some of which I'm going to be commenting on. So essentially, briefly, just let me give you a prep here. Prior to 2008, the Supreme Court had only held, and this is a quote, the Supreme Court and federal courts held that it only applied in the context of militias, the right of states to protect themselves from federal interference. Okay? Up until 2008. In 2008, the Supreme Court decided the District of Columbia v. Heller, 5-4, overturning a handgun ban in the city. The conservative Justice Antonin Scalia wrote the opinion in narrow but unprecedented terms. For the first time in the country's history, the Supreme Court explicitly affirmed an individual's right to keep a weapon at home for self-defense. At home for self-defense, okay? Justice John Paul Stevens, dissented. He said that the decision showed disrespect for the well-settled views of all of our predecessors on the court and for the rule of law itself. Every single time, I think it was 8 times, from like 1880 or something to 1947 or whatever it was, somewhere in there, there was like 8 times the Supreme Court upheld that the Second Amendment was about militias and nothing else. Suddenly in 2008, that changed. But we're going to get into the N.R.A. and where they come in here because there's quite a bit going on there. Now, let me get back to this. The reasons that motivated the framers to protect the ability of militiamen to keep muskets, or that motivated the Reconstruction Congress to extend full citizenship to freed men in the wake of the Civil War, have only limited bearing on the question that confronts the homeowner in a crime-infested metropolitan area. There is no evidence that the Supreme Court ever intended to give the right for people to walk around with guns on their holsters or in their pocket or in their car. Okay, that was never the case. And up until then, since 2008, by the way, the Supreme Court has completely refused to revisit this issue. This is very interesting. I'm not sure why. I think it really comes down to an internal vote, and there's enough on there that even though the Supreme Court has never ruled that this is tolerable, they continue to sort of almost just let it happen, which is just irresponsible. Now, attempts to parse the original intent go all the way back to the Revolution and its aftermath, when the country's founders bickered about what exactly they were talking about. So we're getting now back into what was going on in the development of the Second Amendment. Okay? The militias were at that stage, we're talking about back in the time when the country was developed. The militia were at that stage almost exclusively a slave control tool in the South. Now, before I continue, I've got an article that I'm going to touch on here in a minute by Tom Hartman that will blow your mind. It will blow your mind. It will disgust you, and it will gross you out at what you're about to hear. Because I think what you're going to hear is, even if you're a gun rights lover, even if you're a lover of the Second Amendment, this should shock you. Even if you're on the right wing of things, this should shock you. That the slave owners were terrified of revolts and wary of Northerners who would undermine their system. So essentially what was going on here was that the southern states had these slave patrols, these slave militias, okay? And they were very concerned that if they didn't protect those, they couldn't keep slaves in place, okay? So the Federalist Madison Compromise was to promise a Bill of Rights. So the Madison Compromise was essentially, after weeks of tense debate, the Federalists narrowly won the vote to ratify the Constitution, And they essentially wrote that the amendment gives the rights to states to have an armed militia. Okay, that's why the Second Amendment exists. That's why it was written. It was never, ever, ever intended for the right to bear arms for individual people in their homes, or to run around in the street, or have them in the car, or go to the park, or walk into a store with them. That was never, ever, ever, ever the intent of the Second Amendment. And what really makes me really ill is that these quote unquote constitutionalists make this argument that their strict interpretation of the Constitution says, no, this is the way it is. Man, they're not even trying to read history here. They're just lying. Again, the pro-gun lobby, the pro-gun, or I guess I shouldn't say pro-gun lobby, because you can be pro-gun, but also be pro-regulation, which is what Canada is, which is what Australia is, UK, Germany, France, everybody else. So they're just lying to you, Americans. They're lying to you. Now, after the Civil War, the Second Amendment's rights were again debated in Congress, which abolished militias in the form of Confederate states and passed the 1866 Civil Rights Act, explicitly protecting freed slaves' rights to bear arms. Now, this is very interesting, okay? A century later, the founders of the Black Panthers took up guns. Remember the Black Panthers? Remember those guys? Walking around with shotguns and shotgun shells on their chest? And they did this to press for equal civil rights in California. That's why they did it. But guess what happened? Guess what happened? The state's conservative lawmakers promptly took up the cause of gun control. Whoa. In 1967, the year I was born, Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Mulford Act, banning the public carry of loaded guns in cities. Do you know why he did that? Do you know why Ronald Reagan did that? Because his owners, because let's just be honest, he wasn't an independent mind. He was told what to do, and he was run by masters. Ronald Reagan was told by his white conservative masters that what was scaring them wasn't the fact that there were all these white men running around with their guns. No. The second black people wanted to carry guns. We need gun control. Isn't that ironic? Now, the N.R.A., what's so interesting is that, and I'll just read this quote from this article. Winkler, a UCLA professor, has said that during the 1970s, a revolt among the membership profoundly altered the N.R.A. overnight. This was the 1970s after this happened. Since 1930s, the group had supported restrictions on machine guns and public carry, but angry hardliners took control over the organization in 1977 when moderates wanted to retreat from lobbying work. The group then began a decades-long campaign to popularize its uncompromising positions. Yeah, so in summary, the N.R.A. had been for gun control when the blacks came around and said, hey, I want to carry a gun. And the N.R.A.'s mentality was, well, now what we want to do is we want to make it so that, and here's the kicker, now jumping ahead 30, 40 years. Everybody can get guns now. They're not worried about slaves anymore. They're not worried about blacks running around, black nationalists doing their thing. So now they're like, oh, well, that fear's gone. So let's just get guns in the hands of everybody. So the convoluted nature of how the Second Amendment has been dealt with and how the N.R.A. has manipulated public opinion is, it's disgusting. It's filled with lies, and it doesn't even deal with the truth or history or the facts in any way. I mean, again, going back to Ted Nugent, he's lying. Donald Trump, he's lying. The N.R.A., they're lying. We're going to get into the N.R.A. I keep saying that. We're going to get there in a second. But I want to jump into this whole thing about the slaves and why the Second Amendment was created in the first place. This is shocking. I'm going to take just a sip of water here. You get talking so long, your mouth dries. So there is an article dated January 15th, 2013. It's called "The Second Amendment Was Ratified to Preserve Slavery" by Tom Hartman. I'm going to read just a few segments of this because this is mind-blowing. The real reason the Second Amendment was ratified and why it says state instead of country was to preserve the slave patrol militias in the southern states, which was necessary to get Virginia's vote. Founders Patrick Henry, George Mason, and James Madison were totally clear on that, and we all should be too. In the beginning, there were the militias. In the South, they were also called slave patrols. slave patrols, and they were regulated by the states. In Georgia, for example, a generation before the American Revolution, laws were passed in 1755 and 1757 that required all plantation owners or their white male employees to be members of the Georgia militia, and for those armed militia members to make monthly inspections of the quarters of all slaves in the state. The law defined which counties had which armed militias, and even required armed militia members to keep a keen eye out for slaves who may be planning uprisings. So, okay, let's just start with that. So the reason why the Second Amendment was even happened eventually, we'll get into that in a minute, but there were these things called slave patrols. And the southern racist, well, the whole country was racist, but the southern part of the country was slave-owning racist. And they wanted to preserve what they had. Okay? Now, let's get into this. So, the Georgia statutes required patrols under the direction of commissioned militia officers. Okay? And they had to, and what would it say here? It said that they were to examine every plantation each month and authorize them to search all Negro, this is quote unquote, all Negro houses for offensive weapons and ammunition, and to apprehend and give 20 lashes to any slave found outside plantation grounds. So minute off grounds, they're it's just, God, it makes me sick to even talk about this. I can't even believe it. And it's really, what's really gross is we're only talking a couple hundred years ago. It really isn't that long ago. And if you're talking about, the Republicans moved to, change their position because blacks suddenly wanted to carry weapons. Again, that's only like 40 years ago, So the racism and the lies and the BS is still around. It's not like this was the past and we're just talking about the past. This is a big part of American legacy. If you're American and you're a patriot, you love your country, then this should make you sick. It really should, in my opinion. I consider myself a patriotic person, and it makes me ill to think that this is the nature of one of the key legislative acts in the history of the United States, where this comes from. So by the time the U.S. Constitution was ratified, hundreds of substantial slave uprisings had occurred across the South. Blacks outnumbered whites in large areas, and the state militias were used to both prevent and to put down slave uprisings. So again, the militias were doing their job, killing, torturing, beating blacks for trying to be free. Okay? And so let's get into then the Constitution. Their main concern was that Article 1, Section 8 of the newly proposed U.S. Constitution, which gave the federal government the power to raise and supervise a militia, could also allow that federal militia to subsume their state militias and change them from slavery enforcing institutions into something that could even one day free the slaves. So the states were thinking, okay, wait a second. If we allow a federal mandate for a federal militia, then we won't have the ability to tell those militias to go beat our slaves, right? To shoot them or to torture them or to lash them or to search them and to treat them like dogs, or worse, treat them like, slaves. This was not an imagined threat. Famously, 12 years earlier, during the lead up to the Revolutionary War, Lord Dunsmuir offered freedom to slaves who could escape and join his forces. So the British said, hey, you know what? We'll take the slaves and we can fight the Americans with it. So this was a very real threat. Thus, the Southern legislators and plantation owners lived not just in fear of their own slaves rebelling, but also in fear that their slaves could be emancipated through military service. So at the end of this article, it talks about the compromise. So Madison, who had at Jefferson's insistence already begun to prepare proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution, changed his first draft of one that addressed the militia issue to make sure it was unambiguous that the Southern states could maintain their slave patrol militias. His first draft for that became the Second Amendment, and it originally had said, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person." So it was like twofold. He was trying to make it so that the states still get to keep running their slave patrols, and you can't force or you can't bring in the ex-slaves into the military against their will. But again, what would be their will? Well, the slave owner would decide their will. So this was a defense against both of those things at the same time. But Henry, Mason, and others wanted southern states to preserve their slave patrol militias independent of the federal government, so Madison changed the word country to the word state and redrafted the Second Amendment into today's form. So there you go. Okay. So, all right. So now we know for sure that the Second Amendment was originally designed to oppress slaves. That was the deal. It was a compromise so that Southern racist, violent slave owners could beat and control and torture and continue to own and to punish and to prevent the freedom of their slaves. Okay? That's the facts. Sorry, Americans, but that's the reality. Now, the N.R.A. All right. So there's a wonderful article I came across with Politico. And I'm just going to read you the intro because it's very strong. Quote, "A fraud on the American public," end quote. That's how former Chief Justice Warren Burger described the idea that the Second Amendment gives an unfettered individual right to a gun. When he spoke these words to PBS in 1990, the rock-ribbed conservative appointed by Richard Nixon, this was a conservative, was expressing the long-term consensus of historians and judges across the political spectrum. So, there is no question about it. Again, I keep coming back to it. But I'm sorry, but the Second Amendment never was intended for an individual right to bear arms, first of all. So the ridiculous practice of it now is total bull. Again, I'm trying not to swear. But also that, again, we're coming from a history of why was it set up? To prevent slaves from being free, to continue to patrol slaves, and to protect slave states so they could keep oppressing slaves. Getting back to this article. There is not a single word about an individual's right to a gun for self-defense or recreation in Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention. There is not one single note of this. Nor was it mentioned, with a few scattered exceptions, in the records of the ratification debates in the states. Nowhere was this discussed, this individual right to a gun. Nor did the U.S. House of Representatives discuss the topic as it was marked up to the Bill of Rights. In fact, the original version passed by the House included a conscientious objector provision. Okay? A well-regulated militia, it explained. Here's the provision. A well-regulated militia, it explained, comprised of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But no one... Oh, I've actually read this already. Sorry. Same quote I read earlier. But again, never a comment at all about the idea that you have the right to walk around with a gun in your coat or in your car. 4 times between 1876 and 1939... Sorry, I said 8 earlier. I misspoke. 4 times the U.S. Supreme Court declined to rule that the Second Amendment protected individual gun ownership outside of the context of a militia. Okay? Wasn't 8. I'm sorry, I misspoke. 4 times. So there you have it, the N.R.A. Okay, so I'm going to catch my breath because that's just gross. It really is gross. When I began to study this topic, I really thought that I would find a real debate on both sides. I really did. I really believed that I was going to come across something that had a debate in it. No, there's no debate. The history is very clear. The Constitutional Convention was very clear. The horrible gun private show loophole, which I'm about to touch on, was obvious. It's obviously designed. Literally, if a rapist or a murderer can go get a gun at a gun show, I don't even know what to say. Really, seriously, folks, if you're listening to this, are you not saying to yourself, are you freaking kidding me? That really is possible? No, I don't believe him. Well, go look it up. Don't go to the N.R.A. because they're going to lie to you. But I'm telling you, this is a fact. Okay. So we're going to get into the N.R.A. now. Okay. So let me touch on the N.R.A. a little bit more in detail. There's a lot here, so just sort of, now listen carefully. There's a lot here I'm going to throw at you in a brief period of time. Over the last 40 years, okay, the N.R.A. has transformed itself from a largely non-political organization into one of the most powerful ones in Washington, D.C. And the bulk of its influence isn't financial, okay? as James, guy's name is James Surowiecki, I think his name is. He wrote in the New Yorker in 2015, the NRA's annual lobbying budget is around $3 million. That's about a 15th of what the National Association of Realtors spends. Okay, the NRA's biggest asset is actually the voice of its members. A law professor, Adam Winkler, once said, NRA members are politically engaged and politically active. They call and write elected officials. They show up to vote, and they vote based on gun issues. So history, who cares? Slave patrols, doesn't matter. What the law says doesn't matter. What the statistics don't matter. It just comes down to these people want to protect their gun rights, and they don't care what the rules are. They don't care what the history is. They don't care what the statistics on homicide rates are. They're just out there voting. So here's the thing. If you're an American and you vote, you better get out there and vote, because the only reason why you're losing on this gun right issue has nothing to do with the numbers. The numbers are on your side, man. They're on your side. It comes down to whether you vote or don't. If you don't vote, nothing's going to change. To mobilize that passionate membership over the last 4 decades, the NRA has used its advertising to change how Americans see the Second Amendment, from a militia-based policy to one intensely focused on individual gun ownership, and a relentlessly aggressive message that American gun rights are under threat. Behind every ad is this one ad agency, Oklahoma City's Ackerman McQueen. You know what you should do? Go look up Ackerman McQueen, Google him, and send him a nasty email. Make a prank phone call to him, which over the last few decades has entrenched itself within the organization and provided the public face and the message of the NRA. One that aligns itself perfectly with President Trump and his sort of right-wing, I'm a rebel Republican, whatever that means. You know, you're a rebel. Does that mean you've gone back to racism and gone back to where you want to bring slave patrols back next? I mean, anyway, sorry, I'm shaking my head. You can't see me doing it, but I'm just shaking my head. So I've got a 1-minute little snippet I want to play for you. It's a National Rifle ad, okay? Look, you know what? It'll speak for itself. Just listen to the ad, and I'll catch you on the end of it.
They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and comedy shows and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance, all to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia, to smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness. And when that happens, they'll use it as an excuse for their outrage. The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom, is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fist of truth. I'm the National Rifle Association of America, and I'm freedom's safest place.
Yep, that's right. Stop the madness. Clenched fist. What was that actor? Ben-Hur actor. I forget his name. With clenched fist, and he stood up there at a famous speech he gave, where he had some rifle in his hand. It's just ridiculous. And this is hard to believe. This is coming from the same organization that helped draft the first federal gun controls in 1938. Okay, so it's shocking to think what the NRA was before and what they've become now. They're just lying. They changed who they are, and they're changing the facts, and they're just lying to you. So now let's get into, I've got one more clip here I got to just play for you. It's a, let's see now, what is this quote? This is, this is another NRA ad. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. I'm just going to play it, and then we'll, again, like I did before, I'll catch you right on the end, at the end of it.
Are the president's kids more important than yours? Then why is he skeptical about putting armed security in our schools when his kids are protected by armed guards at their school? Mr. Obama demands the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes, but he's just another elitist hypocrite when it comes to a fair share of security. Protection for their kids and gun-free zones for ours.
Jesus. The N.R.A., man. I mean, really, seriously. I don't really know any N.R.A. members because I live in Canada where, more sane people live. But I mean, it really is. And I'm sorry, Americans, if you feel I'm trashing the U.S. I'm not. The United States is a wonderful nation and I love the country. I do think, however, that progressives talk more than they vote. I think Democrats waffle more than they say or admit to, and people get caught up in being lied to and tricked by groups like the N.R.A., by Donald Trump's and these moderate Republicans who, quote unquote, who lie about their positions on things to basically prevent regulations that will help preserve your environment, help make children safe, et cetera, and so on. So I think Americans are guilty. Honestly, you can blame the media all you want. You can blame the N.R.A. all you want, but really at the end of the day, anybody who's being lied to and doesn't look at the facts themselves and doesn't do their own work, it's really on you. You're the voter. It's on you. So, I could sit here and bash the N.R.A., which I will happily do. They're a ridiculous and horrible organization that basically lies to you for a living. But you as a voter are the one that has to step up, and you're responsible for your vote, and you're responsible for your own education. And you know what? There's Google. I Googled all of this stuff to do this show. Everything I got out of here was straight out of Google with just keywords. You can do the same. If you don't believe me, you don't believe these facts, go research them. I mean it. Now, we're getting near the end of our show, and I want to try to wrap it up. And so I want to touch on real briefly, wait a minute. Did I skip the Trump? Did I do the Trump audio? Did I already do the Trump audio? I did. I did the Trump audio. Okay, yes, sorry. My apologies. All right. I want to make sure I don't forget anything. You don't want to skip. You don't want to leave Trump out when you're talking about the real cesspool of politics, right? Okay, so there are two last topics I want to talk about, and I'm going to touch on them really quickly. Universal background checks and gun show loopholes. Okay, now this is from Wikipedia. Okay. Proposals for universal background checks would require almost all firearm transactions in the United States to be recorded and go through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, the NICS. I referred to it earlier incorrectly. It's the NICS, okay? And this particular universal background check is literally 95% of Americans are in favor of it, and yet it's still not comprehensive at all, okay? The gun show loophole. This is really horrible. The gun show loophole, the gun law loophole, the Brady law loophole, or whatever you want to call it, the private sale loophole, the private sale exemption are political terms in the United States referring to sales of firearms by private sellers, including those done at gun shows, dubbed the quote-unquote secondary market. I don't know why they call it that. It's just a market. It was secondary. There are individuals making money off it. It's a market. The term refers to the concept that a loophole in federal law exists under which any person may sell a firearm to an unlicensed resident of the state where they reside as long as they do not know or have reasonable cause to believe the person is prohibited from receiving or possessing firearms. Okay, hold on. Let me read that one more time. Just listen. Any person may sell a firearm to an unlicensed resident of the state where they reside as long as they do not know. How would they know? Or have reasonable cause to believe. How would they have reasonable cause that the person is prohibited from receiving or possessing a firearm? So I could be a murderer or a rapist, a serial killer, and I could walk up to you and say, Bob, I want to buy that semi-automatic machine gun or that semi-automatic weapon, that AR-566 or 5.55.6 or whatever it was at the top of the show. I talked about that guy who killed those people in Texas. I could go to a gun show and buy one of those tomorrow. I could go to Washington State because I'm from Washington State. I could go to Washington State gun show. And well, actually, Washington State might have a regulation on that. I didn't research Washington State particularly. Some of the states attempt to regulate this, but most do not. And this is really disgusting because I could literally get a resident card in another state, or I could fake one and go into a gun show and buy a gun from some Joe, and I could be a murderer or a killer or a rapist, and there's nothing to stop him from selling to me, and there's nothing to stop me from getting it. Amazing. Well, we've reached the end of this wonderful show, this wonderful fun time we've had. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to also thank my own wonderful team at contactsforless.ca, our sponsor. If you buy contact lenses and you're in and you're in Canada, please go to contactsforless.ca. Buy your contact lenses with us. You save money, you save the planet. It's that simple. Please check it out. But I just want to finish with these thoughts. You know, I have a little daughter. She's 4 years old. Well, she's turning 4 in like a week. And I have a beautiful wife. And I love them dearly. And I'll tell you, if I was in a state where some crazed maniac bought a gun who shouldn't have been able to get one, and they shot my daughter, killed her, and shot my wife, not only would my life be changed forever, I would probably become a different human being. I would try not to be angry and vindictive and pissed off and want to go and, do something to somebody. But I think that at the end of the day, I would feel as if whoever was the person who had voted for that loophole to stay in place would be my enemy. Now, I'm not in that boat, and I can't say that that's how I would feel, but I try to put myself in that position, what it would be like to lose my own daughter and my own wife, okay? Because of a stupid and deceitful interpretation of the Second Amendment and a deceitful public campaign by the N.R.A. and by Donald Trump and by Ted Nugent and all the right-wingers who push this lie on the American public. And I feel bad for the American public because they're unwitting victims of this lie, this BS. There are so many good people out there that want to have guns. And they want to have guns just like Canadians. Canadians have tons of guns. There's so many guns in Canada. But we're not fed this BS. And we're not tricked into believing this stupid story. So, my name is Paul W. Slusher. I want to thank you for listening. I'm sorry if I've offended anybody, but I'm not sorry for revealing the facts. I'm not sorry for giving my opinion about what is clearly the truth. There is a truth and there is a lie. And the truth is the Second Amendment was never intended for individual ownership of weapons anywhere. The Supreme Court changed that in 2008 to make it so that you can have them in your house. So it's just been a complete bastardization of the original concept. And that original concept anyway was there to basically oppress slaves. What the heck, Americans? Come on. So I'm Paul W. Slusher. Thank you very, very much for listening to this podcast. You've been listening to, my announcer is going to tell you everything she needs to at the end here. So thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful, I hope you had a good 2017. And there'll be another podcast coming up in just another week and a half, 2 weeks. And so be listening for that. And I just want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for taking the time to spend the time with me and to listen to my rants and my opinions. And if you have any feedback at all, you can write to us. Write to the email podcast@contactsforless.ca. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful month, a wonderful year. And if you're listening to this sometime near New Year's, have a wonderful 2018. Thanks for listening.
Earth, We Can Do This has been brought to you by contactsforless.ca, the only online contact lens seller in Canada to give away half of its net profits to help save the planet. So thank you for listening and thank you for supporting contactsforless.ca.